Hi, everybody. I think we are live and people are tuning in. Thanks so much for joining us on a Tuesday night at 8 p.m. We have just started the series to talk with authors whose work we find really compelling, relevant, and important. And so glad to see a lot of folks interested in this talk in particular tonight. My name is Sarah Miller. For those of you who might be new, I'm the executive director of the American Economic Liberties Project. We're a nonprofit organization here in DC that focuses on questions related to market power and market structure and policy. So tonight, in particular, I'm really excited to have an in-depth talk with Professor Elizabeth Popp Berman from the University of Michigan, who recently published a new book called Thinking Like an Economist. I think for those of us who have worked in economic policy, who've worked in democratic administrations, who've worked in kind of progressive economic and social policy, this book is essential reading to kind of understand the parameters, the ideologies, the assumptions, and the values that are animating, even when we don't necessarily see it, a lot of the policy discourse and the political outcomes that I think we're all observing and concerned about today. So I think even though this book is a history, I think it's an incredibly relevant history. To me, it is in many ways long overdue as a history that I found hugely illuminating in explaining the thinking that, as a former Democratic administration official under Obama and Treasury Department, were incredibly relevant to policy decisions that were made. So I want to let Professor Berman kind of summarize the book and talk about it a little bit, and then I would love to kind of take questions from the community that's gathering here tonight. For those of you who are more online, there's been a kind of robust and interesting debate, particularly over the last kind of several months, but not exclusive to that, about the role of economists in democratic policymaking, the power of economists, the different kind of contours of economic thinking, how that affects kind of big policy questions that have bearing on lives of millions of people and the outcomes of our politics. So thanks so much, Professor Berman. I'm incredibly excited to hear you talk about the book in person and to ask you questions before we turn it over to the audience. So you go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being with you here tonight, and it's really nice to get to talk to folks in a policy space and not just in an academic space. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a couple of slides. They're really more just like pictures. But I am not going to be talking for a very long time tonight. Sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go. And so I'm just gonna try to do a couple of things in the 15 minutes or so that I'm gonna take to introduce the book. One is just to give you a little bit of a sketch of what the overarching argument is. And then I'm gonna take a couple of minutes and try to illustrate that by talking about one empirical example, just talking about environmental policy really briefly to kind of put a little bit of flesh on it. And so the book is called Thinking Like an Economist, How Efficiency Replaced Equality in US Public Policy. And I open the book by talking about the Obama administration. And so I'm sure that you all remember the Obama election was seen as a real transition period in US politics, right? Obama campaigned on a message of hope and change. He was really embraced by progressives. He was the first Black president. He was seen as really bringing in a new era where things were going to be done differently. And while Obama certainly came into office at a time with a lot of challenges, notably the financial crisis, he did also have the benefit of Democrats having control of Congress for the first couple of years of his administration. But if we look at what Obama's administration's policies actually were, and at the things that it tried to accomplish, what is notable is as much the ways in which those policies were continuous with the past as really breaking away from them. And, we could talk about this in different areas. So we could talk about, financial policy or the administration's approach to climate. But you can get a good sense of this just from looking at sort of the administration's signature accomplishment, which is really Obamacare, right? And if you look at Obamacare, on the one hand, it was a major accomplishment. It extended insurance to millions of people who didn't have access to it before. But it was also, in some ways, relatively conservative, relatively continuous with the past. It was modeled on a Republican state legislation. It looked not actually all that different from a proposal that President Nixon had made in the early 1970s. And while it did increase the number of insured people, it didn't create universal access to healthcare. It didn't create a right to healthcare, and it achieved its goals by trying to by creating a complex system that tried to harness competition in order to keep costs down, and that sort of incentivized the purchase of insurance by providing subsidies. And a lot of options that might have been front of mind for Democrats in an earlier era. So possibilities like simply having, universal health insurance that was not means tested and didn't include cost sharing, which were, very much the standard Democratic platform in the 1970s. It's not that they weren't mentioned, but they were never really seriously considered. They were never really the starting point for discussion. And again, while the administration faced all sorts of political and economic constraints, what's striking in some ways is not that it tried to achieve really ambitious things and failed. What's striking is really how constrained the horizons of possibility were in the first place. And so what this book does is really put forward an argument that tries to explain one piece of why that horizon of possibility was constrained. And specifically, it argues that between the 1960s and the 1980s, what I call an economic style of reasoning spread throughout Washington and became influential in a lot of new ways. And when I say economic style of reasoning, what I'm talking about here is sort of a basic microeconomic Econ 101 way of thinking about policy problems. Focusing on trade-offs, thinking about choice and competition, thinking of margins, focusing on cost effectiveness, and especially viewing various kinds of efficiency as really the measure of what makes for good policy. And what the book does is first, it tries to show how this came to Washington, where it came from, how it spread, and how it was institutionalized in different policy locations. And so I sort of do that by following two particular intellectual communities. One is a group of systems analysts who came from the Rand Corporation. They came to Washington with Robert McNamara in 1960. And in addition to affecting the Defense Department, had a lot of influence on social policy and on the executive branch more generally. And the second group of people that I follow is a looser network of industrial organization economists. And these folks came particularly from Harvard and from the University of Chicago, and really came to Washington with new ideas about how to think about governing markets. And one thing that's notable as well is that while these folks came from across the political spectrum, for the most part, with the exception of George Stigler here, who's on the left, for the most part, they were not primarily Chicago school, conservative, libertarian, free market sorts of folks. They were people who were center-left Democrats who wanted to use government to accomplish social goals and thought that the tools of economics could help it to do so better. So in addition to sort of providing this historical account, and the book covers a couple of big policy domains. It looks at social policy, it looks at market governance, and it looks at social regulation, mostly environmental policy. But in addition to sort of following the spread, it also tries to make the argument that this had real political consequences. And in particular, that by advancing efficiency as really a central value of what makes for good public policy. Other competing values that had historically been kind of central to the Democrats' mission, and that have been pretty successful for them. So arguments about rights, arguments about universalism, arguments about equality, that to the extent that these were in tension with efficiency, those values sometimes got squeezed out. And so what ends up happening is that while the economic style has the potential to conflict with values across the political spectrum, in practice, what often happened was that Republicans proved pretty adept at using the economic style strategically, while Democrats were more likely to find themselves constrained by it, and limited their own horizons in order to align better with the economic style. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes now to illustrate this through a particular example. And that is an example from environmental policy. So what we've got here is a picture on the left of Richard Nixon signing the Clean Air Act of 1970 into law. And on the right, we've got George Herbert Walker Bush signing in the Clean Air Act amendments 20 years later in 1990. And if you look at this early period, this 1970 period, this is a moment when there's a big wave of environmental legislation. You got the National Environmental Policy Act, the EPA is created, the Clean Air and Water Acts, and so on. And this legislation is motivated by a mix of different kinds of arguments. So there is a strong thread that is ecological, that is about the interconnectedness of living systems and the need to protect the environment because of that interdependence. There's a strong moral component to it about the moral objections to polluting the earth, that it's simply wrong to do so. And there's a political framework built into it as well, particularly around the idea that what we need in order to avoid regulatory capture is to have strong, inflexible rules. What you don't see in this early wave of legislation is much economic reasoning. These laws often just required set standards and required them to be met, or required firms to adopt the best available technology. They did not see the environment through an economic lens, which would be one that saw pollution as an externality, and the solution to that to be pricing it, to internalizing the externality. And economists were making those arguments at the time, but they weren't very influential in environmental policy. And they tended not to be very happy with the way that this legislation approached its problems. And in particular, the ways that it failed to account for the difference between improvements that would be cheap to achieve and those that would be relatively expensive, and to really think through the trade-offs between reducing pollution having costs as well as having benefits. In fact, it was so much the case that they felt marginalized that one person who wrote a book about the Clean Water Act a few years later subtitled it, "Why No One Listened to the Economists." Nevertheless, the legislation largely worked. It was pretty successful in achieving what it wanted to. Okay, fast forward 20 years, we're now looking at amending the Clean Air Act. And by this point in time, the economic style has become much more influential. The centerpiece of the Clean Air Act is the acid rain program, which is designed to solve a problem that has come to the forefront in the 1980s. And the acid rain program is the first national level cap and trade program that really does take this economic approach to environmental policy. So you effectively, you give people permits so that they're allowed to pollute a certain amount, and then they can trade with one another so that you try to reduce costs as efficiently as possible. And the language around the legislation changes as well. So no longer do we have the kinds of language that's about harmony between man and his environment, which is directly from some of that earlier legislation. But now we're talking about designing mechanisms to protect the environment in economically efficient ways. Now, like the 1970 Clean Air Act, the 1990 acid rain program was also perceived as quite successful. and it became a model for cap and trade programs around the world. So one question you might ask is, well, why does this actually matter, right? Why are these not just different paths to reach the same goal, different ways of thinking about the same problem? Or even, the second option is preferable to the first because it reaches the goal in a more efficient way. But the case that I would make is that the success of the economic style, and particularly because it became dominant enough that an economic way of thinking about pollution became really the only way to be taken seriously, came at a cost of its own. That by seeing pollution only as an externality problem that you could solve with a price mechanism, you had to give up on certain things that predecessors had actually known. And so, for example, you have to sort of give up on taking ecological arguments seriously. You have to give up on taking seriously the politics of cap and trade, and both the likelihood of achieving it and the political risks in actually designing an effective program relative to using standards that might be simpler and less flexible, even if they're less efficient. And you have to give up on some of the moral power of those original environmental claims, where pollution is not just an externality, but morally objectionable in a way that can sort of muster support from broader swaths of people. And so through commitment to a technical ideal that, while laudable in some ways, proved practically and politically difficult to achieve, it closed off conversations about other ways of achieving environmental goals, whether those are motivated by a focus on designing technological improvements rather than on designing markets, or whether they're about making moral claims around the environment, as for example, the environmental justice movement might, rather than simply viewing it as a technical problem to be solved. And so if we bring this back to the present, and think about where we are today, we're in a period where we see a lot of continuity with what's come before. Certainly, the economic style is still alive and well in Washington, and can be found everywhere, and anybody who's involved in policy is going to find themselves navigating it. Yet at the same time, there are also clearly signs of change as well. New voices have come to the forefront, and people are making arguments that aren't necessarily couched in economic terms and still being taken seriously. And this is something you see particularly in antitrust policy, where Biden's appointees have been folks who are explicitly not committed to the economic style in ways that their predecessors have been. Yet at the same time, we also see how persistent it is, that even if you've got people at the top who are using other language, who are saying that efficiency is not the only thing that matters, that there's still a very thoroughly institutionalized set of people and way of thinking that is committed to how people have thought about problems for now several decades. And so you can see this in sort of defenses of the consumer welfare standard and if efficiency is sort of the correct lens for thinking about the problem of monopoly. And so at a moment where it seems like bold, ambitious solutions are really more direly needed than ever, it remains to be seen whether challenges to the economic style are truly gaining traction, or whether the economic style is itself entrenched enough that it will continue to limit the horizons of possibility in years to come. But what I would say is that economics provides a really useful and powerful toolkit, and where we can harness it in support of deeper political values, we should by all means embrace those tools. But when we find that those values conflict with the values of economics, we should instead advocate for our own values without apology, rather than allowing our values to be defined by the values of economics. So I will stop there. There is a discount code for the book, and thank you all for listening in.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to ask a few questions, and then I'm sure we'll get some in the chat too. But one of the fascinating things, because I just haven't I haven't encountered a lot of pieces of scholarship like this, is that, you know, you told the story in a very granular way about how basically a concept that was developed and executed in the context of World War II and in the context of defense kind of moved into water, moved into education, hit a roadblock, didn't move forward in this area, found a foothold here, became embedded in a bureaucracy. You know, just kind of the hopscotching of this way of thinking about policy that, you know, from the Democratic perspective, kind of really fully turned the corner during the Carter administration. You know, was kind of incredibly fascinating. And to me, it also helped to explain, I think, something that we are seeing now in our politics, where in some areas, like you know, rightly noted, antitrust, we have seen in some ways a real turning of the ideological page, not obviously completely because courts and there's lots of kind of centers of power, but in terms of leadership of the administration, they kind of look at the world through a different lens and a different set of values. But I guess kind of my question is, like, when we see how economic reasoning kind of embedded itself in different ways from a policy perspective in healthcare and education and jobs and in competition and antitrust, like, how does that make you think about kind of our current political situation, in which, you know, it seems still incredibly dominant in kind of many areas in terms of what can be taken seriously and what isn't? And then kind of in antitrust, like, there's really been this, I think, very unexpected kind of ideological change and breakthrough. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that
Like,
totally makes sense.
why
Yeah.
is that because there's certain leaders? Is that because it's more weakly established? Is that because there's less kind of stronger institutional, you know, bureaucracies, right? Which,
Yeah.
anyway, the kind of, you know, bureaucratic kind of culture, kind of power struggles, I thought were so interesting and kind of useful to grapple with and understand, particularly as kind of we see this, I think, very erratic application of kind of ideology in this administration in particular.
Yeah, no, I think there's, I mean, a couple of different ways of thinking about that, right? And I think at one level, you know, I think a big piece of why it's so resilient is just that it is institutionalized in so many places, right? And that it's built into all kinds of spaces within the federal bureaucracy itself. You know, it's sort of the dominant way of thinking in lots of different think tanks. And so, you know, and so to really achieve change in terms of what the default way of thinking about problems is in Washington, you know, it will require more than just a change in leadership at the top, because you've also got all sorts of people who are embedded into the policymaking process, who, you know, are going to be the people who either have to do the implementing or who have to sort of, you know, translate top level ideas into actual policy decisions. And so, you know, so in that respect, I think any change is going to take a lot of gradual work to build alternative centers of power, you know, in places that house alternative ways of thinking, of which, you know, I think AELP is a good example. And that it's going to take the accumulation of those to have long-term change. You know, at the same time, I mean, I think the other way to answer this question is that ultimately it's all about political power, right? And that, you know, to some extent, this stuff follows from who's got, you know, from what the base looks like, and how much influence it has. And if new people who are more progressive to begin with are elected to office, you know, they're going to be people who are maybe less committed to this, and they're going to tap on folks for advice and for policy recommendations who are coming from different places, you know, who are maybe a little bit less entrenched in this. And so I do think there's a way in which you know, sort of grassroots political power can lead to changes in how people think relatively quickly. So I guess I think it's sort of a combination of the two. And then maybe the third way to answer that is that it's also a generational thing. You know, that I do think that younger people, and particularly people who are, you know, maybe right now in programs of public policy, getting master's degrees, or people who are currently in law school, are not very happy with the status quo and are looking for alternatives. And if people sort of don't just sort of imbibe the dominant way of looking at the policy world as they're sort of in that process of being educated and sort of having their ideas formulated, then eventually they're going to carry different ways of thinking them into policy. And so I think that's maybe another way that things can change a little bit more organically. So it's a lot of different ways, but.
Yeah. I mean, as I was reading your book, I mean, this is getting a little bit more detailed, but I mean, one of what seems like really glaring flaws of the kind of way of economic reasoning that we've seen really kind of take root in our politics is that it doesn't accommodate questions around power.
Right.
And it's kind of like, it feels like, oh, well, in the beginning, it'd be like, well, that's a huge problem. Maybe like this isn't quite the way we should be thinking about these like deeply political questions in which power, is kind of a major factor in terms of outcomes we're likely to see. But maybe it would be helpful before I talk about some of the questions that we're getting in the chat, just to kind of explain, I think, the core of what that kind of economic reasoning is and what it means and what it doesn't mean. Because I think, one of the assertions in Jason Furman's review is that you were kind of arguing that economists have too much power. And one could make that argument. And I think there's a reasonable argument to be made, but your argument was clear that it was this economic way of thinking, that was this economic kind of reasoning, that it was kind of this intellectual culture, which had really constrained the types of ideas that you could seriously articulate. And having worked in government, I've been in rooms where you're not going to be the person that's going to throw out the idea that everyone's going to like look at you like you're crazy and you're going to ruin your career. And like, it's very clear where those boundaries are in many circles, so it kind of, naturally constrains kind of the avenue for debate in some ways. It certainly wasn't my experience, but how do you think it happened that, those questions around political power and capture and corruption, like just were kind of vacuumed entirely out of this way of making really hugely consequential policy choices?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different things that are going on in that process. I mean, I think one thing that the economic style has done in a lot of different policy areas is it depoliticizes problems, right? It turns problems into technical problems to be solved, rather than actually being about fights over power and about who gets to sort of decide that the direction that policy is going to go. And I think if you look right, like I think the history of anti-poverty policy is a great example of this, where the war on poverty sort of started out not very much in an economic framework. It was sort of organized around the idea of community action and the idea of political participation and sort of empowering poor people to have political voice. And this created lots of political problems for Democrats very quickly, because once you started funding people to effectively make political demands, they start making political demands, and then the mayors are in an uproar about these demands that are being made on them. There's pressure against Lyndon Johnson to try to address these demands, and all of a sudden you've got a political problem. And it's also important. Race is obviously, this is central to this as well. So you've got a conflict that is essentially now about race as well as poverty. And so you've got economics comes in, kind of starts to gain influence in this time, and just has a very different way of framing the problem, and says, well, what's the problem with poverty? What's the problem is that people lack income. You don't have to think about how political systems work. You don't have to think about race. The problem is getting income to people. And, we can kind of debate what the best way to do that is. Negative income tax was a big solution at the time, but it allows you to bracket these questions around power, around really conflictual things like race, and instead say, we're just sort of going to neutrally find the most effective way to solve this problem. And so, so it does have this ability to depoliticize problems that I think is kind of one piece of why it's been so successful. And I think you could see that in other policy areas as well. I don't think it's limited to anti-poverty policy.
We have like a blizzard of questions as I thought So I'm going to just start going through a few of them, and hopefully we can get through most of them. So first one is, I'm curious about your reaction to a line we've started to hear about the failure to renew the temporary expanded CTC, that it shows that an alternative to the economic style doesn't actually bear the politically self-sustaining fruit as had been hoped. In Jason's review of Thinking Like an Economist, he makes the provocative claim that means-tested, targeted policies are actually more politically sustainable than universalism, which I thought that was notable as well.
Yeah. I mean, so I think, on the second part, like, I think the question about whether means testing versus universalism is going to be the most politically effective is something that's very specific to particular policy areas, and it's going to actually vary from place to place. So, I certainly would not say that the only policies that make sense to implement are universal policies, and that means testing never makes sense. But I do think that that historically what the economic style has sort of done is say that means testing is effectively always better than universal policy, right? So if you look at something like Medicare, Medicare would not have made sense from within an economic framework because there's no reason to provide social insurance to everybody when some of the people can pay for it themselves, right? It's not as cost effective. It's simply not going to be, it's not the best way of doing it. And so, so I think it is something that kind of does vary from case to case, but the issue I think really is that starting with the economic style kind of puts universalism off the table right away and says that if the policy isn't designed to be as efficient as it can be, then necessarily it's not as good as it could be. And the second part about the expanded child tax credit, can you say the first part of that question again?
Oh yeah.
Sorry, I just missed.
No worries. Curious about your reaction about the failure to renew the temporary expanded CTC, and that it shows an alternative to the economic style doesn't bear the politically self-sustaining fruit as had been hoped.
Yeah, again, I guess I think it's just one of those things that's specific to very different political circumstances, and sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not going to work. But the question is, what's the range of options that you're able to consider in the first place?
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things in the book that I did not know was kind of Alice Rivlin's role in the debate between how to fund access to education. Do you fund the institutions? Do you fund public colleges and universities, or do you fund individuals so they can kind of shop? That, maybe you can speak a little bit about that as I kind of go through the questions, but what a consequential choice, right? And how relevant, that is today. And that was a decision that was made, many kind of decades ago, but maybe we can kind of reflect on the outcome there, right? Instead of kind of funding institutions directly, to kind of fund individuals as a more quote unquote efficient means to provide access at a low cost to government.
Yeah. And the context here, right, is that in the late 1960s, higher education was rapidly expanding, federal funding for higher education was rapidly expanding, and pretty much everybody agreed that it needed to keep expanding. But the question is, what's the best way to do that? And up until that point, most of the funds had been provided to institutions. So government would, give different colleges and universities certain amounts of money, and then they would, spend them and decide how they were going to admit students and so on. And of course, the colleges and universities like this because they're getting to control the money directly. But you do start to get an argument, that was being advanced by economists, and Alice Rivlin played a key role in this, about a better way to do this would be to attach the money to students rather than giving it to institutions. And the idea here is that you're promoting choice and competition, basically, right? That if students have the money, they're going to be able to take it to where they think they're going to get the best education. Universities will have to compete with each other a little bit to make sure they're performing well, and it will be a more beneficial outcome all around. And so that was sort of one reason that we got a shift towards what started out as being primarily grant-based funding, but also quickly became loan-based funding as well. And so you have a really, a real shift towards this system that is a little bit more market-like, that, had consequences that I think were partially unintended, in that they, in the things that universities competed on weren't always the things that I think policymakers hope that they would compete on. They weren't necessarily competing on providing the best education. They were competing on other kinds of dimensions. All right, I guess we've got a problem because it's not just me. Oh, there we go. Here comes Sarah. Give her a second and see if she's able to reconnect.
While we let Sarah reconnect, I can read you the next question in the chat. Sorry about that.
That sounds good.
Okay, so Lindsay from Groundwork says, thanks for an incredible book and for taking the time this evening to discuss. I'm interested in hearing more about how Republicans have been better able to exploit the economic style to their advantage and how or why Democrats have not. She said, I think one interesting takeaway for me around the economic style is that while the economic style can result in less optimal policy impact, it also frequently results in inferior strategy and tactics too, which itself can reduce potential policy impact.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question and a great point. I think so in the book, the part that I focus on mostly in terms of talking about Republicans using the style more strategically is looking at the Reagan administration. And so, up until that point, the economic style was used relatively similarly across political parties. Nixon and Ford didn't look all that different from Johnson or Carter in terms of how their administrations were using it. But what Reagan does that is really different and distinctive is his administration is much more intentional about advancing the economic style in areas where it supports underlying policy goals and rejecting it or reining it in areas where it doesn't. So for example, in antitrust policy, where at the time, the Chicago school was sort of on the rise in antitrust, the dominant position within economics was really about limiting antitrust enforcement. Reagan strongly supported the use of economics. And so, you see it at a point in which the antitrust division is having its budget slashed. The economics office is actually seeing its numbers expand. But in social policy, for example, the administration really saw economics as existing to justify programs that shouldn't be there anyway. So, the economists are looking at how to do, anti-poverty policy or healthcare policy more cost effectively, whereas the administration just wants to have less of this stuff. And so in those areas, you see pretty much just a rejection of economic arguments rather than seeing them expanded like you do in antitrust policy. And as to why Democrats have been less good at this, this is one of those questions that I get and is really hard to answer. I do think there's a piece of it that Democrats, that progressives tend to be believers in expertise, and economics is sort of the dominant form of expertise that we've had for the last couple of decades in policy spaces. And so I do think there's just a divergence that's tied to broader political positions in how much deference people give to experts. And then I also think there's a piece of it that's really about underlying structural constraints and underlying structures of power, right? That I think some of this, I don't think that economics is what caused the shift to the right that happened after the 1970s, right? It's sort of overdetermined by the larger political economic environment, by changes that are happening at the global level. And there's lots and lots of reasons for this shift. But what's critical is that once that shift happens, then economics becomes one way that it is sort of institutionalized and it's sort of made sticky. So once it actually happens, then that makes it harder to break away from. All right, so I'm not sure if that's entirely an answer to the question, but at least part of it.
Yeah, sorry, my internet decided not to work in the room I was in, which I always love. Let me ask one more here. This one is, it seems like the economic style you discussed came to replace other ways of thinking about policy near the end of the civil rights movement. In the social policy chapter, you specifically discuss how the focus of some great society legislation turned from redistributing political power to service delivery, which you talked about a little bit. But I'm wondering if in your research you learned anything about the interaction of civil rights discourse in the 60s and the rise of this new way of thinking. And that's a question that I had as well as I was reading it. How are kind of other kind of outside dynamics affecting the stickiness, the proliferation, the kind of political usefulness of this way of thinking? How, you talked about how it was often aligned with kind of what corporations were pushing for. But I think this is a particularly interesting and kind of pertinent lens to kind of examine, because it just certainly seems like just a remarkable success story in some ways of just embedding an ideology like really deeply throughout, in different manifestations, but through both kind of Democratic and Republican administrations.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one way to think about that would be that, I think there are spaces where rights claims retain more power and spaces where they lost ground. And so, something like civil rights, I mean, in spaces like Office of Civil Rights, or places where that was sort of, newly established spaces where that was sort of, the motivation for creating new offices, and, they're organized around rights. Those places didn't necessarily encounter a lot of resistance from the economic style, which didn't necessarily have an alternative argument to make in that particular space. But I think the spaces where you see rights-based arguments really eroding is in spaces where there are rights that are costly to achieve, and then you raise the question of, well, okay, should we be thinking about costs and benefits rather than treating these things as rights? And so, I think already I talked a little bit about environmental policy, and sort of, different kinds of environmental rights would be one space where you see this. Should we just say people have the right to clean water regardless of what it costs? Well, that was an argument that had a lot of influence at one point in time, but over time you have this increasing push towards, well, we need to think about costs as well. You can't just say this is a right and it's absolute no matter what it costs. We need to weigh costs and benefits and think about trade-offs. Another place, and maybe this is a little bit closer to the civil rights example, another place where you see this is in rights around disability access. And so in particular, that, in the 1970s, you start to have, you have handicapped people are supposed to have the right to access, forms of public transportation on an equal basis. And again, this is the kind of thing where it's motivated by civil rights kinds of arguments. It's not supposed to incorporate costs, but within a few years, it's kind of hitting this cost benefit kind of argument where people who are sort of embedded in the bureaucracy now are saying, okay, well, that's great, but just look at how much this is going to cost for this few people who are actually going to use it. Is this really worth it? And then you have sort of pushes to back away from this rights language and sort of move towards more of a cost benefit framework. Oh, I think you're muted, Sarah.
Sorry. One of the anecdotes that was in the book was about, I think, how CBO proactively scored Carter's, I think it was his, like, energy plan before there was any bill drafted or anything like that, and just kind of how brazen that was to basically, score kind of a policy proposal that early in the process. But I think particularly, sorry if my internet's being a little bit wonky, but I think particularly in the context of Congress, the story of the establishment of CBO, which kind of we've certainly talked about a lot internally at Economic Liberties, and then the question that you kind of pose at the end, and that somebody posed, I think, here in the chat too, of like, do we try to kind of occupy these offices, or do we try to get rid of them? Do we try to change the institutional structures? Like, with the limited amount of energy, like how should we think about really solving this problem kind of in its final form?
Yeah.
And I just think that really is a tension here. Like, do we get our own economists to argue different things? Or do we say, we don't need to listen to economists as much as we do. We need to rethink our cultural relationship with them as policymakers. We need to look at history. We need to, look at more qualitative forms of research that might not come from economics. Like, I'm just curious how you kind of think about that question, because that's a really strategic one when it comes to how we actually try to change the institutional structures and kind of the personnel that shape policy in these really fundamental ways.
Yeah, I mean, I really think this is easy to say, right? But I really do think it's both and, right? That it's not one or the other, and which strategy you sort of foreground is going to depend on exactly what question you're talking about. And so I think, for example, with something like the Congressional Budget Office, I think that having alternatives to the Congressional Budget Office that produce numbers of their own, that are kind of operating very broadly within an economic framework, but that are perhaps centering different values or counting things differently, or modeling based on different assumptions. Like, I think that's absolutely something that is worthwhile to do. And that definitely some of this has to be about changing the way that calculations are made, right? Changing the way that modeling happens, bringing different sets of assumptions in so that the space of economic analysis actually expands. But at the same time, I mean, I do think that the piece that is about, just making other kinds of claims, of using other kinds of expertise, of looking to, to history or to institutional analysis rather than to, mainstream economics, is also really important. And I guess, one way to think of it too might be strategies that are inward facing versus outward facing, that I think that when you're trying to accomplish things where there are gatekeepers who are very much invested in the economic style, that you kind of have to engage with it in order to be able to participate in that conversation. And so in those cases, I would think that the way to approach it is to see, how much can you move it? How can you expand it? But I do think, right, the places to make, big, bold arguments that don't really concede anything to that are in these sort of more public facing or more outward facing spaces. And I think that's often where, you might see sort of a standard center left think tank still making the same types of arguments, even if they're doing it at a little bit more of an external audience. And, I think there's just no reason to confine yourself to that kind of language if you're not being forced to by some kind of institutional constraint.
Yeah, I mean, another anecdote in your story, which I think, makes you kind of question a lot of these exercises at a kind of more fundamental level, are, I think there were two kind of offices in the Labor Department. One was like Ask B and one was Ask Ben. And I was like playing, like, can I remember this acronym? But they had different policy goals, and they built their own models to basically figure out like which one would be more effective or more efficient under the framework. And like, lo and behold, like both of those models produced outcomes that were aligned with the policy goals of Ask B or Ask Ben, right? And so I think you can't help but wonder, are a lot of these tools really reflecting kind of the preferences or the biases of the people who are kind of operating them? Like, all of these tools, right, are they're not kind of these kind of scientific, perfectly unbiased, ways of making decisions. They can be built to produce certain outcomes, right? So if you see an example like that, where you have two different offices running the same model and they produce outcomes that, reflect back on their preferred policy choice, how should we think about some of these, I think, deeply technocratic, complex tools that are just not I can't understand, like, I can't have a view because I don't know how to build a model. I don't know how to operates, right? Yet, and I think that's true for a lot of these folks in these policymaking decisions. You're kind of relying on what feels like deeply complex scientific data without the actual ability to really understand how that's created. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, and I think, right, like there's one piece about it that's just about, denaturalizing this stuff, right? That these aren't just technical decisions that somebody's making that, that are somehow value neutral, but that they do reflect, all kinds of values going in. And, if you think of something like cost benefit analysis, that, historically cost benefit analysis has not taken distribution into account at all, right? So, it doesn't matter whether a policy is going to benefit the top 1% or is going to benefit sort of a wide swath of people. If it has, $100 million of benefits, it doesn't matter who it goes to. And many points in time, people have made the argument that, well, we should really consider this as this is an important part of thinking about weighing costs and benefits, is thinking about, well, who's actually getting who are the costs falling on and who are the benefits going to. But traditionally the answer has been, well, that's a political question, right? That's a political question. And so we're going to bracket that. We're not going to include that in the analysis, and we'll let the political people deal with that after. But, rather than actually sort of ensuring that that's dealt with by different people, I mean, what it does in effect is just sort of exclude it from consideration. And so you produce these analyses, you produce these numbers that simply exclude that as a value that you should be considering. And you produce an analysis, or you produce some numbers and erase that as a possible factor that could have been considered and built into the analysis. And so I do think there's a piece of it that is about people who are operating in the more technical sides of these spaces. Again, just being really explicit about, here's what the values are that are going into this model or into these calculations. Here's why we're doing it the way we are. And really calling out the ways in which values are embedded into them, particularly when they're things that look on their face like they are neutral and that are portrayed as just being sort of technical tools, and as not having any kind of values embedded within them. So I think there's a lot of space for people to be working on that area.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think when I think of cost benefit analysis too, like this could be a whole series of conversations, but things like financial crises, right? There's certain large things that seem either excluded or impossible to really include. So as a non-economist, as a non-kind of technical person, sometimes I have the same reaction that I initially had to the consumer welfare standard, was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, I must be missing something.
Right.
That
I don't. The way it is, right? This is the way we do things. Right?
As a normal person, like this seems to not make any just logical sense. Like, I'm confused. Like, I feel kind of the same way when I encounter kind of economic tools and policymaking kind of in general. It's like, is this really rooted in reality? Is this really asking the right sets of questions and incorporating the right sets of input? And, I think there are some results that I think should speak for themselves a little bit, but
I think there's areas in which like that becomes super clear too, right? Like, if you think about like modeling around climate, right? Like, what kinds of assumptions are we going to make about what the economic impacts of climate change are going to be in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years? The idea that this is something that we can make a very good estimate of is just it's just crazy, right? Like the
isn't it? Yeah,
even within a factor of 10, right? So
right.
To the extent that you're sort of trying to quantify this, I mean, it can be useful to quantify things and try to weigh them systematically, but it often just sort of pretends that there's a sense of certainty that just isn't possible.
Yeah. And I guess we're about 5 minutes out, but what's been the reaction to the book? Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the common critiques that you've encountered and kind of discuss your your views on those, because I think it's rightly kind of stirring up a really good and important and timely conversation, but it's one that is not, it's a universe that is, I think, incredibly powerful, incredibly influential, as your book shows, but it's one that not very many people are a part of, right, on the inside.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I've been I've been like pleasantly surprised that people are taking it seriously, right? I mean, because I think
Don't say that.
right? I guess at some level, I hope that economists would read it, but I didn't really expect them to, and some have, and so I've gotten some positive feedback and some critical feedback, but it's been sort of gratifying that people are taking it seriously. I think, right, there's one set of critiques that are just about, well, yes, this is historically, this is roughly historically accurate account, but this is just a better way of doing things, right? That, sure, like rights matter, whatever, but, ultimately we have to weigh costs and benefits. We need to do this systematically, and we need to be able to, and it's good to be able to try to estimate, the most efficient ways of doing policy. And, I think some of that is as much, some of it is about just kind of value differences and what are your priorities in terms of what you're trying to achieve with policy. I do think, right, another set of criticisms, and this was, you mentioned the Jason Furman review, is that, the book really attributes too much power and influence to economists. And I do try to make this distinction between, the influence of economists as policy advisors, which I don't think is that large, and do think is constrained in all sorts of major ways, and the influence of this broader way of thinking, which is carried well beyond people who have economics PhDs or formal training in economics, and becomes influential in this much broader space. And I do think, my hunch is kind of that, if you're participating in this world, if you're actually a policy person, it's very clear how little influence you have, like as an individual in an everyday sense. And so it's just sort of hard to step back and see, the water that you swim in effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one that I disagree with, but I see why people make it. But a lot of the reception has been really positive, and, they've definitely, we spoke about this a little bit before we started, but, I've talked to a lot of people in policy spaces who have said, oh, this like really captures what I've always kind of been aware of, but never quite been able to articulate, like why this world looks the way it does. And so that is very, gratifying that it seems like the book has captured something that
yeah,
actually
as a Treasury alum who was not an economist and worked with a lot of economists there and other places, I think one of my main reflections leaving that building was that I think people deeply believed that they were making decisions based on science that was actually devoid of values, and that was a good thing, and that ideological decision making was not just problematic but irresponsible. And that there was a real blindness to the values that were animating the policy decisions that were made. And it kind of just set me kind of on this whole journey of thinking about what is and isn't within the bounds of policy conversations and policy debate, and why. And coming from, a complicated set of bureaucracies like Treasury and related divisions and departments, what your book also did, which I think is so essential, is it mapped the way that institutional structure, not just personnel, but institutional structure, holds on to certain ways of doing things and certain ideologies. Like, I did not know the origin of all the policy planning departments, right, that are in every single agency. And I found that totally fascinating. I didn't necessarily know kind of the growth of urban and Brookings and how closely they were aligned with kind of this way of thinking and the need for evaluation and the need for personnel and staff. So I think just, for anyone that has worked in administration, has worked in Washington, is working on these policy areas, like it did feel like this essential but hidden history that explained kind of so much of the way kind of our government is structured and how that structure kind of bounds the ideas that can move, not just because it necessarily limits what is brought to decision makers, but because it's a deeply, deeply embedded kind of intellectual culture that even if you have leaders in place that want to do things differently is very hard to overcome, whether you're looking at a CBO score or you're looking at an office of kind of economics or division of economics at an agency. It kind of lets you know like what you're up against if you want to really create deep change and open up what feels possible in what's often like pretty small conversations, we think, in DC. So anyway, we're 1 minute over, but thank you so much, Professor Berman. I love this. I loved your book. I'm so glad we had such great turnout. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions because I selfishly asked too many of my own, but we will certainly follow the reviews and the ratings. And yeah, thank you for some really, I think, exceptional and unique scholarship.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was really great to talk with you, and it was nice to finally get a chance to chat.
Yes. All right. Good night, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.